Welcome to the after show.
Yes, yes.
That was a good episode. Oh, I feel like I say that every time, but I'm a fan
It
of the Cultivating
was.
Her Space podcast.
I
What can
mean,
I
me
say?
too,
What can
obviously.
I say?
Yes, yes.
Obviously. Yes, yes. Oh my gosh, girl.
But overthinking is something
Hmm.
that it makes sense why, when I really started thinking about, who the people are that overthink,
Yeah,
it makes sense. I
it
think about
does.
myself as a kid. I remember as a kid, my mom would call me a worry wart, right?
Mm.
But I think a lot of it, all these things tie into each other, right? So I think started worrying because I was adultified or
Mm.
parentified,
Okay,
right?
okay.
So I started being concerned about things that most children aren't going to be concerned about. So it makes sense that I got into this space or this habit early on to overthink everything, right?
Yep.
So if I, as a kid, am aware that there's issues with bills, right, being paid, and just issues about just all the things that parents worry about.
Hmm.
If I'm aware of these things, then as a kid, I start to worry and I start to operate from a stance of how do I alleviate this worry from my mom, right?
Hmm.
Or I would start asking, she would say something, and then I would start asking questions about before she could even really say everything that was happening. Like,
Mm.
let's say I remember one of my sisters wanted to take a middle school trip and they were going to Disney World or something. And
Hmm.
before my mom could even start saying any details or information, I started on that worry train of, so who's paying for this? How
Hmm.
long is she going?
Yeah.
And do we know chaperone? I'm like,
Wow.
I'm in high school. This ain't shit I needed to be worried about. But I
Exactly.
had gotten conditioned to worry about these things.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Dom. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the origin of a lot of the overthinking because we have very similar backgrounds. And when you shared that, I
Hmm.
was like, oh yeah, that does make sense. You know, growing up with anxiety, having to be parentified at a young age and care for younger siblings and all of those things, and even trauma and abuse, and thinking about,
Right,
being stressed out in my environment and making sure that I was safe. And so it makes a lot of sense when you think about your childhood and what you were raised around. So that was a really good point that you made, and also a really good example. And oh, my heart just breaks when I think about our younger selves and the things.
yeah,
In high school, you're supposed to be worrying about your science fair project and like
right.
your own, high school dramas. You know, we all got our
Hmm.
little drama. Not another child and the chaperones, and but so mature of you because you were so accustomed, I'm sure, to hopping into that role. And I have so many situations I can probably think of too where I worried about stuff where it was like, you should not be worrying about registering kids for school when you in college trying to finish, your own stuff. So I think
Right,
this was definitely it's a good topic. And yeah, I think many of us have been faced with things that cause us to overthink. But I'm glad that we have tools and we discussed some of the tools that we can use. One thing I meant to mention on the episode was mindfulness and meditation as
yes,
well. And I
hmm,
find that that has been super helpful. However, now having the baby, it's been like my meditation practice looks very different now. And I
hmm,
feel like it's a little more challenging. Well, one, I can't meditate. I have not meditated for as long as I used to because
right,
for obvious reasons. But then also I find that when I do have space to just be, it's a little more challenging to quiet my spirit because
yeah,
I'm like, wait, the phantom crying is the thing where you think you hear a baby
hmm,
crying, but the baby's sleeping. There's no crying, so I'm thinking I hear crying. So that's a little tricky. That's a little tricky. So I'm still trying to navigate what does it look like for me to get into a space of mindfulness and meditation now having a newborn. So
yeah.
yeah,
And that, being compassionate and taking time,
yeah,
And I do one thing that I wanted to point it out too in the episode that I didn't get a chance to point out
yeah,
is thinking about acknowledging how there are ways in which overthinking has served us, which is why we continue to engage in the behavior, right?
Oh, how? Let's talk about that.
So if you think about where we are in life, right? Think about getting through graduate school.
Mhm.
Think about moving to a new city. Think about all like career changes, job changes, things like that. You would not have navigated those in the way that you have if you hadn't had some level of overthinking, right? Because
Mhm.
think about it like this. Think about when you and your husband moved here
Yeah.
to San Francisco,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Think about how all the planning that went
Mhm.
into that, right?
OMG. Yep.
And if we're really being honest, think about, as you mentioned on the episode,
Mhm.
about your birth experience,
Mhm.
right? Think
Yeah.
about all the things that went into planning that. Think about all the stories you heard from other people and how you use that to think about problems ahead of time
Mhm.
and solve for X ahead of time, right?
Yes.
And so there are ways in which overthinking can definitely serve us.
Yep.
And so when we see that it serves us, then the narrative in our head is, well, why would I stop? Right?
Exactly. Yes.
I planned for worst case scenario. Now maybe worst
Right.
case scenario didn't happen,
Yeah.
but I was ready.
Uh-huh. That's a really good point. I love that you brought that up. That's something that my therapist shared at one point too, is looking back on the things that served us in the past, but realizing, especially if our situation has changed, realizing that, you know what, I'm going to thank myself for using that tool that I, had and needed at that time. But now we're going to use a different method.
Yes.
That's the green room reminder. Whoops. We're going to use a different method to, maybe I should say that all over. Okay, Daniel, you can edit that part out. um, but yes, that's something that my therapist shared, and she said that oftentimes we have these traits that we, used in the past that served us at
Yes.
that point, but now in our current life, it's like, oh, that doesn't serve me anymore. So thanking ourselves,
Yes.
our younger selves, for using that tool that we had and now
Mhm.
practicing a new habit. So I think that's a really great point that you shared, and yeah, it's just that's on point. Still a work in progress. We're going to continue to work on these things
Exactly.
for sure.
That's all we can do with anything in life.
That's it.